They should have seen that they weren't able to do what they wanted to do and find people who could help them. Welcome to the season finale of Off Book. This is our 25th episode, and that seems to be the exact amount of dollars that a little musical called Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark made. For those of you that don't know, Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was, well, a musical about Spider-Man. On paper, this looked super good. It had a protagonist that seemingly everybody loved, a plot based on a super successful film trilogy, iconic characters, and the opportunity for stunt scenes that you don't find very often on Broadway. However, one Google search will tell you that it did not do well. It was open for almost 3 years and had 1,066 performances, but somehow lost $60 million. It's become synonymous with epic failure in the theater community. So how does what looks like a great concept end up performing so poorly? Let's take a look. I think in order to understand why Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark did so poorly, you have to take a look at the story. Because while originally the plot of Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was very similar to the plot of the movies, it ended up being something very, very different. And the script went through a lot of changes over the development of the show, and by the time that it opened officially on Broadway, it had introduced so much more mythology to the show. One of the reasons for that is because the director and co-writer of the book for Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, the creative team for Broadway's The Lion King, which did super well with that same kind of style where you have some of that artistic imagery. It's not literal, it's very, very artistic, and has elements of mythology and culture and history to it, which works for The Lion King. Not so much for Spider-Man. Part of what makes Spider-Man such an endearing character is that he is just like all of us. He isn't a rich billionaire who created a metal suit. Am I talking about Batman or Iron Man? You'd have no idea. Anyway, it isn't somebody who is genetically mutated. It isn't somebody who has powers from a freak storm. It's just a guy who was a normal human being and then got bitten by a spider. That spider could have bitten anybody, which is what makes his story so relatable, because he's just a regular human that something weird happened to happen to. That's a weird sentence. But in the Broadway production, he wasn't just bitten randomly by a spider. At first, that's what we think happens. Spoilers for Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark in case you haven't seen it. You can't anymore. But spoilers nonetheless. We find out later that it wasn't by random. It was actually a Greek goddess that sent the spider to go bite him, and also made Peter his suit because he was special and he was predetermined to be Spider-Man, which is a great idea, to take the relatable, friendly neighborhood character and make him, destined by literal goddesses to be a superhero. That's a good move. Also, the other coincidence that forwards the plot and helps to characterize Peter as he's trying to balance his personal life and his role as a superhero is Uncle Ben's death. In the original movies, he happened to be in the car when a carjacker came and tried to steal the car and then got shot. The carjacker didn't pick Uncle Ben's car on purpose, he just happened to pick the car that Uncle Ben was in. It could have happened to anybody, further illustrating the coincidence and the relatability of the story, because it wasn't that anything was predetermined. However, in the Broadway production, Uncle Ben and Peter share one scene, not nearly enough to develop any sort of relationship between them. I guess the writers were assuming that everyone had already seen the films and knew that they were close, but they didn't develop that at all. And then, the only reason that Uncle Ben is in the car to get shot in the first place is because he was chasing after somebody who stole it from one of Peter's classmates, I think, and then was in the car, which kind of undoes the whole coincidence of it, because he did kind of ask for it in this version. So the loss of Uncle Ben isn't nearly as meaningful, because we never got to see Peter have any connection to him, therefore we have no connection to him. And it seems a lot less random, because Uncle Ben went and chased after the person stealing the car. And then they also had Green Goblin die in the first act of the show, because Spider-Man dropped a piano on him off of a skyscraper in New York City. And he dropped a piano on him because it was a musical and the writers thought that that would be funny. Now, full disclosure, I haven't seen the show, but I don't really think that would have made any sense. And then there was also this Greek chorus type thing called it was called the Geek Chorus. Get it? Because it was nerds, and they were narrating the story, and they really had no reason to be in the show. There was no need for that. We don't need people to narrate Peter's story. We want to spend more time with Peter. It's all about his life and his humanity. And having people comment on it doesn't help us feel any closer to him. It actually distances us from him. And eventually we learn that the people in the Geek Chorus are currently writing a show about Spider-Man, which turns this into a show within a show, and that definitely didn't need to happen. It was so convoluted and crazy, and it didn't make any sense. And they actually went and changed the script after they opened on Broadway. They opened on Broadway, closed the show, did some major rewrites to reduce the size of the Greek goddess, to reduce the Geek Chorus, and to let Green Goblin survive into Act 2, but also decided to introduce the rest of the Sinister Six and eliminate some of the most famous ones, like, Mysterio, but created new ones just for this show to get it back to 6. And when Peter decides to stop and let them wreak havoc across the city, it isn't because he's suffering anything legitimate. It isn't because he's trying to work through a lot of this pain. It's just because he wants to have time to be in a relationship with MJ, which is sweet, I guess, but we also haven't been with the character long enough for him to earn that. In the movies, it was sweet. In the movies, it made sense, because we had been with him through several movies of him trying to navigate being Spider-Man, and so when he gave it up, it made sense, we understood it. But here, he didn't have enough time to do that. So it just felt forced, or selfish. Neither one is good. But the problems with the writing extended beyond the book, into the music. The music for Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was written by Bono and the Edge, which have a very specific sound that I think, on paper, made sense for Spider-Man. The issue was, however, that they, well, it's not a big issue, it's just that they never heard Broadway music before. The producers actually had to burn them a CD of classic Broadway songs to teach them what show tunes were, and Bono and the Edge didn't like it. So the music for the show, as you can probably imagine, wasn't that good. It didn't feel like musical theater music, but not in the way that like it's good and it's breaking boundaries, just that it doesn't work. It sounded like subpar music. I listened to the album to prep for this, and the music at best was pretty catchy, and I could, tap my foot to it, but the album only has a 51-minute runtime, and by the time I got to the end of it, I couldn't tell you what a single song was. I couldn't pick out a bass line, or lyrics, or chord progression, or even a feeling. I know what the plot of the show is, and I couldn't even tell you where each song fit into the timeline of the show. I didn't know what each song corresponded to plot-wise. It didn't sound like a cast album, because it wasn't. It wasn't lyricists and musicians creating a Broadway score. It was a band creating some music that was kind of sort of about Spider-Man, but they didn't actually like show tunes, so it didn't sound like any show tunes because there weren't show tunes. Now, if I couldn't recall the song after 51 minutes, you can bet that the people that went and saw the show couldn't recall it either. And so the score didn't really do that well. People didn't really listen to it. There was nothing to recommend. And that, I think, was kind of the downfall of the show, that the entire thing was, at its very best, mediocre. So when people went to see it, they didn't recommend it to people. And Broadway shows get a lot of publicity from word of mouth. People need to be talking about a show. And people were talking about it, but not to call it good, because it wasn't. At its best, it was mediocre. And I think that shows that this show wasn't quite ready for Broadway. Today's episode is sponsored by X-Men, the action-packed new musical. The folks over at Marvel studied Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark and determined that the reason the writing was so terrible was because Peter Parker wasn't quite relatable enough. But their latest theatrical endeavor will solve the problem of seeming human entirely by making their leads not human at all. It'll feature original music by Bono and the Edge, direct from the original creative team of Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, and a book by Rian Johnson of Star Wars Episode 8 fame that will completely disregard all of the X-Men movies. X-Men, the action-packed new musical, coming to a Broadway theater near Broadway very soon. Or not. You know, maybe there's more to Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark's failure than just the writing. Let's talk creative team. The creative team for Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was riddled with problems before they even started. It was supposed to be produced by a legendary Broadway producer. However, he was pretty old, and as they were in the room signing all the contracts, he had a heart attack, and he died a few days later. This left his protege, a young, inexperienced producer that really had no idea how to put on a Broadway show, in charge, and that caused a lot of problems, because he didn't have the expertise to guide a show through production. The director, like I mentioned, was straight from Lion King and had a lot of ideas, which is good, but she also had a little bit too many ideas and refused to back down on any of them. The Lion King had found a way to restrain her and to surround her with people that could tell her no when they needed to. However, this inexperienced producer didn't know to. He thought,
well, she knows what she's doing. Let me just let her do what she's doing. She probably knows more than I do.
The music was written by people that had never heard a Broadway show tune before. You can start to see how this creative team, while it might look good on paper with Broadway professionals and celebrated musicians, didn't really work that well when they started to try to put together a show, because none of them had the skills needed to put on a show with the other people in the team, and cracks quickly began to show. Nobody in the creative team was getting along. Bono and the Edge actually went on tour and stopped coming to rehearsals, which is kind of an issue when you're in the middle of writing a show, when you're not writing a show or coming to the rehearsals of the show or doing anything with the show. It definitely seemed like they didn't really care, which is kind of an issue, and that caused a lot of fights. Eventually, the rest of the creative team decided that they couldn't work with the director and her grandiose visions anymore, so they decided to hire somebody else to redo her show without telling her, and then eventually fire her after they'd already come up with a new plan, which ended very well. She actually left pretty amicably and went and supported the show and said on social media that she didn't hold any ill will towards them. Wait, never mind, she sued them for defamation and scheming to kick her out. So that did wonders for PR. Nobody in the creative team seemed to actually be able to work with each other or do what they were supposed to be doing, and when they did, well, the problems continued. You see, Spider-Man swings around New York City by using webs. Webs which are in movies computer generated. It's very easy to make someone look like they're flying through New York when they're a mannequin that someone else is holding onto, or flying through a green screen. It's a lot harder when you're in a live theater. So how do you make someone fly around? Well, the solution they decided was fly rigs. For those of you that don't know, fly rigs are a very common theater contraption where an actor will get into a harness, and the harness is attached to cables, and the cables extend all the way up onto the stage behind the wall above it, where there are the mechanics to open and close the curtain and lower and raise backdrops, and also make people fly. It's pretty common. It's how Peter Pan flies in pretty much every production of Peter Pan ever. The only catch was the theater that Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was going to be performed in didn't have those at all. So the production had to go install all of those mechanics. Plus, they wanted Spider-Man to swing not just on stage, but also through the audience, which meant that they had to install these fly rigs all the way on the ceiling of the house, not just on the stage. And then they had to pay to cover all those mechanics up so it still, looks good. That cost a whole bunch of money. Add that to the incredible price tag that this director's grand visions had. It was insane. There were huge projections, there were walls that were supposed to move as Spider-Man was bouncing. It cost a lot of money to pull off what she wanted to pull off. Not to mention that in order to get Spider-Man stunts, they had to cast so many different stunt doubles in order to sustain a 2-hour show, 8 shows a week, where Spider-Man was swinging throughout the entire show because he got bit by the spider really early on. It was like the first or second number. So there were constant stunt doubles just swinging everywhere. That cost a bunch of money to hire all those people. They also, because they couldn't agree on what the show was and how to develop it, and they were working with such difficult people, the rehearsal process and workshops and previews lasted so much longer than it usually did. For reference, shows will rent out a theater before they actually open on Broadway, because that way if the show doesn't ever open on Broadway, the theaters don't lose any money. It's a way to help get potential shows into a theater and give theaters more reassurance about letting them in because they know that they're not going to lose any money until they know the show is going to make some money. But because of how long Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was in rehearsals and in previews, they racked up a whole bunch of money to the theater. But then once the show opened, everything was fine, they sold out for years and years, and they were able to pay back so much to the theater. Okay, no. Things actually got worse once they opened. Because those stuntmen that I mentioned, they got injured. A lot. Somebody actually died. Which, A, is terrible for PR. B, costs a lot in medical bills. Their insurance wouldn't cover it after a while. It seemed like things were just continuously going wrong over and over and over for this production, and everything that went wrong cost them so much more money. Eventually, after they'd worked out all the problems in the production, and they opened on Broadway, the show actually did pretty well. And I'm not joking. People were coming from all over to see Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark. The only catch was, they weren't going to see it because they wanted to see it. They were going to see it because they had been hearing for close to 5 years now how terrible it was and how many things kept going wrong. And so they wanted to see the dumpster fire in all its glory. So the production started making some money from all the bad press they'd been getting, and for a while it seemed like things might be okay. They wouldn't. Because the reviews of the show continued to be terrible. The people who went to see it fail got exactly what they were looking for. The show hadn't gotten any better since they closed it for rewrites. People expected something terrible, and that's kind of what they got. The best reviews were an overwhelming meh, meaning that there was no desire for people to see it, except for the spectacle of it. And that meant that as soon as the novelty wore off, as soon as people got tired of seeing it just to go see it, there was really no one left to go see it. And so they closed. Closed with $60 million in debt. After a whole bunch of negative press, multiple deaths, a court case, and a pretty terrible reputation. Sources say that apparently the show would have had to continue selling out for close to 7 years to pay back the $60 million in debt they had. And anyone that saw the show could tell you that that wasn't very likely. So, where did it all go wrong? How did a Spider-Man musical end up getting hit with so many misfortunes? I think the truth was, it was started by a whole bunch of people that were pretty naive. There was one person in the group who knew what they were doing, and who could have helped to steer the ship to success, and he died before they even started. And I think that while the young, naive, now head producer of this Broadway musical-to-be knew that it wasn't going well, he should have known a little bit better and tried to restructure things. I think that for one, a group that had no idea what show tunes sounded like shouldn't have been allowed to write the music. The music was not good. As I mentioned, I can't recall anything about the score the next day. Julie Taymor, the director and co-writer, shouldn't have been allowed free reign with her vision. There should have been somebody there to restrain her and to help put her on course. The producer should have been able to restrain the budget and make sure that what they did do as a final result didn't cost them a bunch of money. They should have spent more time in the editing room before they stepped on stage, so that way they wouldn't have to pay the theater so much. They should have had more workshops so they could get audience reviews to see how bad things really were. Because for a long time they thought, hey, maybe the reviewers are wrong. Maybe people will like the show once they come and see it. They should have had more people come to see it and give their honest feedback to know that they wouldn't. They should have been more careful when they were rehearsing to make sure that people didn't get injured. And they should have created a show that fit what they were able to do. Technologically speaking, the show was a huge feat. The stunt scenes, the projections, the innovative set design was all very good. In fact, it's something I wish there were more of on Broadway. But there's a reason that there isn't more of it on Broadway, and it's because it's very, very expensive and hardly ever worth the time and money it takes. So there should have been somebody on hand to tell them that if they're going to do this, if they're going to install a whole bunch of fly rigs in this theater, they need to make sure it's worth the huge price tag that comes with it. And then, when they saw that the show wasn't doing well, they should have been able to retrace their steps and figure out where it went wrong and try again. Not try to duct tape something together and hope and cross their fingers that everything will go away and will get better, because I think at that point they knew that things were bad. They had several cast members that jumped ship before they even opened on Broadway. There were several pretty big people that left before they even started previews, because they realized that it was a sinking ship and they had to get off as soon as they could. Unfortunately, the creative team didn't see that, and I think that had they seen that, they would have been able to get new people on board, or even convince the people that were on board already that something needed to change and that they needed to find a way to create a production that wasn't based on their own egos. It was more about creating a show. They should have seen that they weren't able to do what they wanted to do and find people that could help them. Maybe they could have even helped themselves, but they needed to be able to see what was going on, and they couldn't. And so now we're left here without a big Spider-Man musical. There still haven't been a ton of superhero musicals. The kinds of stunts that Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark tried are rarely found, with how much theater has diversified itself in terms of technical capabilities, including projections and unconventional theater settings where the actors go into the audience or circle in the square theater. There still aren't a ton of stunt scenes, especially ones like that. You don't find a whole bunch of even action films on Broadway. Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark was a very weird experiment that didn't go anywhere. And I, for one, am actually pretty disappointed that nothing came of the show. I never got to see it, like I said, but I think that it really could have worked had the circumstances been just a little bit different. Who knows? With everything happening with Spider-Man now, maybe Marvel will try to bring everyone's favorite web slinger to the stage one more time. Next week is the beginning of Season 3, where each episode will break down the score and history of a different musical, all of which were more successful than this one. Until then, have a great rest of your week. I'll see you on the flippity flop.